fallout continues over President Trump's blanket pardons of more than 1,500 people charged and or convicted for their actions in the riot on the U.S. Capitol 4 years ago. For a legal perspective on what the president did and what it means, we welcome former U.S. Attorney Paul Charlton. He's now with the law firm Dentons. Good to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Ted.
What exactly did the president do with these pardons from a legal perspective?
Well, he has this extraordinary power that the U.S. Supreme Court has said is part of the core powers that the President of the United States has, and he can pardon individuals who have committed federal offenses. And so in this instance, more than 1,500 individuals who were involved in the insurrection, the invasion of our Capitol on January 6th, have been pardoned for the offenses that they were convicted of or have already pled guilty to.
Blanket pardon means what?
That means you can still vote. It means you can carry a firearm. It means all of those legal ramifications that might otherwise attach to somebody convicted of a felon no longer attach to these individuals. It means if you were serving a period of time of incarceration, you're let free and you're no longer incarcerated. You are, in a very real way, forgiven of those offenses that you committed.
Compared to commutations, what are we talking about there?
Now, commutation is a little different in the sense that it means you are seeing a reduction in your sentence. If you were told you were going to have to do 10 years in prison and you only have to serve 1 year because you received your commutation today, that sentence means you've been reduced and let free, but it doesn't mean you've been pardoned for the offense that you committed.
And that means your civil rights aren't entirely restored?
That's right. You still have the felony conviction. You still have all of those inhibitions, those things you can no longer do, like vote.
And now these pardons, these commutations, many of these involve violent offenses. I mean, seditious conspiracy. What does that mean?
So, Ted, pardons and the controversies that attach to pardons have been something we've lived with for many years. In fact, George Washington pardoned individuals who were involved in the Whiskey Rebellion going back to the early 1700s. And former President Carter pardoned all of those individuals who avoided the draft. They say there's some 200,000 people. So pardons have been something that have had controversy attached to them for a long period of time. What makes these pardons so much different, so much more stark in the reality of most Americans is that we witnessed these assaults. We saw these assaults on TV. You can go back and look at any number of other pardons that presidents have granted individuals, including more recently President Biden, and it's something we didn't witness, most of the crimes for which people were pardoned or granted clemency. But if you watched these police officers, for example, beaten, almost killed in front of our eyes on television, it makes those pardons, the kind of grace, the kind of forgiveness that underlies a pardon, much more difficult to accept, and for that reason, I think, much more controversial.
Beating police officers, destroying federal property, and there's a sacredness to the U.S. Capitol there, and that was violated.
Precisely, and it was an attempt in a very real way to stop the peaceful transfer of power, something our country has as a cornerstone of its very existence for over 200 years.
The president also wants D.C. federal court to dismiss pending charges with prejudice. Explain.
So if you have a charge that is pending, but you haven't either pled guilty or you haven't been found guilty, the president is ordering federal prosecutors to dismiss the case and dismiss the case with prejudice, which is a legal term, which essentially means it can no longer be brought again. You are essentially receiving a pardon. It means that you're not going to be prosecuted for the offenses for which you've been accused.
And again, 60% of these cases that we're talking about involve violent attacks against police officers. The president calls the charges and convictions a, quote, grave national injustice. These people can never be prosecuted for this again, can they?
They can't, and what is unusual about this is until recently, the vice president didn't see it exactly that way. The vice president said, Mr. Vance, that we ought not to be pardoning individuals who are involved in assaults on police officers. There are people within the Senate, Republicans within the Senate, who disagree with this as well, although many have not spoken out, some have. And most Americans, if you look at the polls, will say assaulting police officers and doing so on television in a way that we can all witness isn't the kind of crime for which individuals are deserving a pardon.
Can the convictions which have been pardoned be used? Let's say I was convicted of seditious conspiracy, whatever, and I was sentenced to 10 years or whatever. I've now pardoned. I go out and rob a Circle K or something. Can that action those activities be used as a mitigating factor in future prosecution?
It's a great question. And so it would probably be, and you'll love this lawyerly answer, Ted, it would probably depend on what kind of a crime it is.
Yeah.
But you'll know that, and you'll remember that even here in Arizona, we've had our own pardons from former President Trump when he was the former president, previous president. For example, Joe Arpaio has received a pardon. You'll remember that Rick Renzi, a former congressman, received a pardon from the President of the United States. So there have been one-off events and pardons that have taken place, again, for crimes we may not have witnessed. These are crimes by the hundreds and more than 1,000 that Americans witnessed on television.
So, but as you mentioned at the start of this, there is precedent for this. What happened this week doesn't necessarily defy precedent or set precedent.
In the sense that he is granting and has granted thousands of pardons, that's correct. As I say, Jimmy Carter,
Right.
by some number, 200,000 individuals who evaded the draft. Former President Biden granted more than 1,000 pardons or acts of clemency to individuals who committed nonviolent drug offenses and to members of his family. So all of that is something, there's controversy on both sides of the aisle that relate to both of those presidents. This is somehow profoundly different, though.
Yeah. You mentioned Biden's preemptive pardons. What do you make of those? And again, what kind of standard does that set?
It's interesting because there's a disconcerting aspect of it wherever you are on the political spectrum, and it's this. If you haven't been charged with a crime, if you haven't committed a crime, and you receive a pardon, there is a concern that going forward, this will become a kind of practice. So incoming presidents will grant broad pardons for events or facts that have occurred in the run-up to the election, all federal offenses. Remember, Ted, these can only be federal offenses. State prosecutors are free to do what they wish, regardless of what kind of a pardon someone receives. But there's a concern that there will be a greater degree of acceptance among incoming presidents to pardon people by the thousands for events that may never have been charged as a crime, and in fact, for events which people will say, I never did commit a crime, but I'll welcome this pardon in the event that someone should look at this differently and politically and seek to charge me with a crime.
Wow, very interesting. Hey, before you go, I got to ask you about today, the idea of the Justice Department saying that if you're a local official and you defy President Trump's orders or whatever they are regarding immigration, we're coming after you. What do you make of that?
That sounds like a very difficult thing to put into execution, to truly force federal prosecutors to do, to charge state and local officials with crimes. It sounds like a very politic thing to say. I know that there is a certain element of the population that would like to hear that sort of thing, but to charge local officials for not doing something is a very difficult thing for a prosecutor to do. To charge somebody for obstructing an investigation, that's a whole nother kettle of fish. But the statement that we're going to go after state and local prosecutors or others who aren't enforcing federal law sounds like a difficult mandate to enforce.
All right, and we won't even get into the idea of federal officials having to rat out other federal officials if they don't go after DEI principles as a part. Maybe that's for the next time when you stop by.
I'd be glad to come back. Thanks, Ted.
It's good to have you.
Thanks for having me.